Bene. Noi non ci siamo ancora presentati.
No,
Paolo,
mi da piacere.
molto piacere. Ti volevo chiedere, io ho mandato la mia
È già,
presentazione, già,
è già qua la
perfetto.
trovi sul desktop.
Perfetto.
Qua.
Poi tocca con il mio clicker. Noi ci siamo ancora presentati. Paolo,
Mi da piacere.
molto piacere. Partito.
My oh yeah, I forgot that. Half for me. The pointer is here.
Yeah.
The reminder phones are here. This one is.
Yeah. Usually I have such a voice, I don't use a microphone. Yeah, but I think with the buildings, like maybe it's
We'll see.
we'll see. Once we close the doors, if I'm not loud enough, then I'll amplify.
Okay, what's your consideration?
Right now?
No, from tomorrow.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Get some water.
Oh, yeah.
Get new cup.
Yeah. Oh, you're very kind.
And the Quino. Sì, sì che adesso la cambi.
Sì, dov'è? Sarà cambiata la sessione l'11. No, scusa, la sessione il 9.
Sì, sì, ma questa, no, questo che se gay sarà
La mettiamo.
11. Tommaso
Hi, Michael. Hi, long time no see. Indeed. I'm sorry we've not managed to catch each other. Okay, 5 times or you wanted them to go to Japan now. Yeah, not yet, right? All right, yeah, how are you? You are. Okay, right, okay, yeah. Yeah, you got here. You were yesterday. How are you? It's maybe it's here. Look at. We're just wondering outside. We're still coming. We haven't seen you yet.
Welcome, everybody. I have a little announcement before
I think
the,
we need a microphone.
yeah,
Oh, this one is working.
yeah, hello, yeah. So I have a little announcement before the start. First of all, we are really sorry about this construction site. It just started last week and we had no idea about it. And so we are thinking how to handle the situation, but right now we have to close the windows in order to avoid the noise. And unfortunately, the air conditioning is gonna get fixed on Friday. So we are without air conditioning. I'm really sorry. We are thinking perhaps tomorrow of moving location. We are thinking about it. So bear with us. And yeah, you can use the great program, as Marco was suggesting, as a fan, always. Second announcement. So because we had some cancellations, unfortunately, Matthew Inglis is also home with COVID, as is Dirk Schlim. We are actually eliminating section 9 and moving the talk of Sergeyev at section 11, so that it's not just one talk alone. So we're going to change the program right now. That's it for now. So I leave it to the chair of today, Paolo.
You. Okay, welcome everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for having done a terrific job, except for blocking these guys, but that wasn't foreseeable. So everything else is just terrific. So thank you very much for everything you have done. It's terrific. And then I'm very pleased to introduce Fenner Tanswell. He is based in Berlin at the Technische Universität, Fachgebiet Theoretische Philosophie. He finished his PhD in 2016 at the University of St. Andrews with a dissertation on the topic of proof, rigor, and informality, which is at the basis of his very recent book for the Cambridge Elements in Philosophy of Mathematics that came out in 2024 with the title Mathematical Proof and Informal Rigor. And I highly recommend you read it. It's a wonderful booklet. So Fenner, after his PhD, worked at the University of Oxford, St. Andrews, Loughborough, Brussels, and now, as I said, is in Berlin. Fenner works with a broad palette. He has contributed to many areas, including proof and mathematical practice, social epistemology, experimental philosophy, and environmental philosophy. His last article, the last article I read is his contribution to the history and philosophy of mathematical practice, in itself a testimonial of the kind of work that this group has generated. It's more than 3,000 pages, so there's a lot of stuff to be read. It's available online, so you can start reading things from there. And his paper is called The Language of Proofs and has to do with imperatives in mathematical language. And this is related, in fact, to today's topic, which is add it up. That's an instruction for you. Recipes and instructions in mathematical proofs.
Thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me to do this. I'm very grateful for the invitation. It's very wonderful. People often ask me, Fenner, are you louder than a building site? And I suppose we'll find out today. I've often given a version of this talk called Go Forth and Multiply, and I thought it was getting a bit stale, so I replaced it with Add It Up. But this was a reference to the 90s folk punk band Violent Femmes, and I guess that's too obscure. I don't know why I did that. That was not a good one. All right, introduction. One of the big successes of PMP that a lot of people here have contributed to has been this challenge to the standard view of proofs and rigor that relates informal proofs to formal counterparts in some way, and says that rigor is generated by this correspondence. And we've done a really great job at challenging this, I think, very successfully, but without a good model of proofs to replace it, this ends up as kind of just a negative project where we say, hey, that standard model is rubbish. But what I'm going to talk about today is something that I've worked on in several papers and with a couple of collaborators called the recipe model of proofs. And the recipe model is a different model which emphasizes different features of proofs that we might be interested in, especially if we're focusing on mathematical practice. So it focuses on proofs as instructions for mathematical activities. And the analogy is to recipes for cooking a particular dish, right? For being in the kitchen. I put up some of the places I've been working on this. So there's a mini chapter on this in the recent Cambridge Elements book, the paper that Paolo just mentioned in the handbook. There's also an education paper, which I'll talk a little bit about with Keith Weber. That's in educational studies in mathematics. So if you're interested in the educational side, I'll say a couple of things about that later. The very first thing I wrote about this was this Go Forth and Multiply paper that's going into an edited volume on the work of Jody Azuni that I wrote 7-8 years ago and is yet to come out. So if anyone sees Ottavio Bueno, you can please hassle him to make sure this book actually happens, and then maybe this paper will see the light of day. It is available online if you want to read it. It's there. It's a little dated. Some of the other stuff is I don't know, more up to date. I also, I say I've been working on this. It's not exactly my model, right? It's of course influenced by a lot of people. We don't need to I don't need to read all the quotes, but just show that some earlier stuff was saying similar things. I think Robert Lava's paper on sets of inferential actions was one of the bigger influences on this, and he was of course influenced by Ken Manders in his work. And I also, even though I disagree in print with Jody Azuni, is one of my favorite philosophers that I disagree with about lots of things, but he's also been a big influence in this. And of course, Sylvia and Valeria's work on diagrams will also show up in it. And many more, right? That's just a couple of things. So the central sort of idea is to see the recipe model of proofs, sees proofs as like recipes in that they give instructions to guide certain kinds of activity. And then just like a recipe is a way of sort of communicating and recording how to go about doing that activity, knowledge of how to prepare something to eat for yourself or someone else. A proof is a way of recording and communicating practical knowledge of how to carry out some piece of mathematical reasoning. And then under this view, proof itself, the written proof or the proof artifact, right? It's just this artifact that serves to record and communicate the piece of reasoning. But really the switch of emphasis is away from that as an artifact to the activity. I've already seen this show up in a couple of talks yesterday. It's very much the zeitgeist of mathematical practice. So what I'm going to talk about today is a sort of outline of implications. Switching that emphasis lets you emphasize various different things. So I'm going to talk about the language of proofs, that proofs thought about this way, we would expect them to sound more like recipes in various ways. Right? They will contain instructions and imperatives. And I will show you a bit of the work from that handbook chapter of the corpus linguistics study, where we showed that proofs do often contain instructions and imperatives. Okay. The recipe model, I think, is a very nice fit for work on diagrams. I take this to be a version, in some ways, of what Sylvia and Valeria have said in their work before, and kind of bring out some aspects of that, what I'm going to say in a second. It also has big implications for the epistemology of mathematics. And I think something that's often overlooked when we talk about the standard conception of mathematical knowledge is obtaining from having a proof of it. It's like how actually that proof links to the knowledge that we have afterwards. Right? There's not like much like digging into what the link is there. And I think that the recipe model does a very nice job of explaining some aspects of how knowledge works. So that's going to sound more like analytic philosophy, traditional epistemology stuff. Another point that's an implication I'm going to skip over today to not overemphasize this. That the logic of mathematics is not just a logic of assertions. So, I think one of the sort of aspects of formalizing mathematics is to turn it all into sequences of assertions. I think if you look at the logic of informal proofs, or the sort of logic broadly conceived rather than just formal logic, it's not always just a logic of assertions and propositions. Okay, finally, the one I mentioned, if you think of proofs in a certain way, then teaching those proofs to students, undergraduates in mathematics should reflect what proofs are really like. So we're going to say something about this. Good. Before I dive into those things, I've got a note on pluralism that I want to say about. So in this Cambridge Elements book, I frame it as a pluralistic approach. If you found the younger me diving into mathematical practice, it was very much like standard view is wrong. I've got a replacement. It's better like this. And I've calmed down a bit now. And the calmer version is that actually I think the standard view is fantastic, which I don't know. Please don't quote me on that to anyone who is my philosophical enemy. I think it's fantastic, right? And I think it's a really great model. And the point is that if you think that the standard view is the correct version of what a proof is, then I think you're like sorely mistaken. However, if you think that formal logic does a nice job of formalizing aspects of proof practice, then I think you're bang on the money, and I think it's great. And the recipe model is meant to present another model, and what's going on with those? Well, I think they're both good models, and I think they both emphasize different aspects of what goes on in proof practice. So the formal logic thing, I think, has very important implications for, well, I can say this later if anyone's interested, for, say, how we respond to like limitative result, like incompleteness or independence phenomena. But it's not so good at understanding things like mathematical knowledge, or it's not so good at all the other things I'm talking about. So I think they're both good models. In the book, I talk about a few other models. I talk about argumentation models, and I talk about Katerina Dutil-Novaes's dialogical model. I talk about virtues a bit more as well. So if you're interested in the pluralist account, sort of more broadly, cool. Right. Let me dive into the language of proofs. So I've already heard it a couple of times here, and it's like very common to see in papers, is that, well, what is a proof? Well, a proof involves a sequence of assertions. I've taken a quote here from Stylianides, who is an education researcher, to not put anyone on the spot, but this is like a very common way of phrasing things, that the term argument denotes a connected sequence of assertions, right? And we understand proofs as a sequence of assertions. And what I'm going to tell you is that that is false. So to see this, right, we're going to look a little bit about the sort of linguistic side of thing, right? On the one hand, assertions are a kind of declarative sentence. They're used to make a statement, like, you know, Brodin found the roots of the equation, there is no spoon, anything like that. A sentence is in the imperative mood, on the other hand, is if it gives instructions or commands, things like that. So phrases like slow down, or eat your greens, or preheat the oven to 180 degrees. Right? Those are two different moods that you find in English and lots of other languages as well. Now, the imperative mood is like very common in recipes. Right? You can see where I'm going with this. I've taken a recipe from the Women Institute's Library of Cookery, because this is open source and I didn't need copyright permission from previous time. But if you look at it, right, I've highlighted all of the instructions that you get. So right, it's all, I think all of it's in the imperative mood. Sorry? Oh, yeah, well. Oh, yeah. Okay. Now, it has been like pointed out a couple of times that there are imperatives in maths as well. It's not been studied in the way we did it, but Brian Rotman famously speaks about this in his work. So he says things like, mathematics is so permeated by instructions for actions to be carried out, orders, commands, injunctions to be obeyed, but mathematical texts seem at times to be little more than sequences of instructions written in entirely operational exhortatory language. And we're going to agree with Rotman quite a lot. Good. So here's an example. I've got the Bolzano-Weierstrass theorem from Introduction to Real Analysis textbook. And right, if you look at it through, again, it's full of imperatives, right? A lot of the sentences are in the imperative mood, not the declarative mood, right? Maybe I could even stop there, right? Because if someone says a proof is a sequence of assertions, here's a proof. If you agree that's a proof, then they can't be right, right? So in a sense, I've got one example that's a counterexample to the claim, but we're going to go into a bit more detail, right? These claims also show up in like quite serious investigations about the language of mathematics. So this book by Mohan Galasingam, The Language of Mathematics, is a fantastic book that tries to formalize the structure of lots of mathematical expressions and things like this. It's wonderful. He does a really nice job, but he just starts from his experience in mathematics, from these are the things that I need to formalize, and has a bit in the beginning where, again, he says that the language of mathematics consists purely of assertions about mathematical objects. So all of the things of imperatives don't show up in this book at all. It's a big, nice book that formalizes loads of bits of mathematics, but none at all of any of the imperative statements. And it's surprising to me. He also makes a prediction about the limited and potentially closed class of verbs. So he's talking about sentences like we suppose, we let, we, etc. And the we does like slightly different work than the imperative things, but he says there's only a few verbs that are allowed for that. To be fair to Ganassalingam, what he sort of says is that he only wants to look at the register used in more rigorous, careful textbooks. And so he talks about the formal mode of mathematics, and a sentence is in the formal mode, if and only if it consists of assertions about mathematical objects, about mathematical facts. And I think there's like a sneaky bit of like, you know, if I imagine him in dialogue with me, there's a sneaky bit of, I think, the question in there that he's like, oh, I'm talking about the rigorous bit, and the rigorous bit is all the assertions, which rules out what I think is the root. Okay. Cool. So that's kind of the status of sort of mathematical languages is. Of course, then we're interested in, well, do these imperatives really show up lots, or was that one proof just a single proof by itself? So when I got my job in Loughborough, I promised Matthew that I would do some empirical work to show that what I was saying about proofs was really true. And this is the upshot of that. Corpus linguistics is the study of text patterns on like big bodies of text. We're in particular, the corpus, the body of text we're looking at is every archive paper from the mathematics section from the first 4 months of 2009. The archive lets you download everything, but there's things about scale and how much time and how much it costs, etc. For people really into corpus linguistics of mathematics, we're using the same corpus as this paper on explanation by Pablo and Lara and Chris and Lou and Chris Sanguin and Matthew all together. It's also the same one that I was talking about on Monday about important and interesting mathematics for anyone that was there. It's also the one that Matthew's more recent paper on tense in mathematics. So it's the same corpus for all of them. The archive lets you download all the papers in bulk. You can get the text files, and then you have a whole bunch of text. And something that they did for this previous paper, I didn't have to do any of this, was you have to process them a bit to tidy up, get rid of all the LaTeX commands, get rid of all the mess. You also face like a very substantial theoretical decision about what to do with all the mathematics stuff. And the theoretical decision they made, and I think makes sense, is just to like replace all of the maths with like a marker saying there was some maths here. So this inline math code is what they use to do that. I think for our purposes, it doesn't make a big difference in the results. The only thing is that I'm reporting a lot of things per million words. And the upshot is that we've removed all of the maths bits, right? So if you want to count the maths as the words, then it's going to artificially inflate the results here per million words, right? But other than that, I don't think it's like hugely important. We had this maths corpus. People writing mathematics very conveniently write begin proof and end proof. That means that you can also extract out all of the bits of maths inside the proofs. So we've got a proof-only corpus done by extracting those. And if you take one and subtract the other, then you get a non-proof bits of maths, right? Which allows for a nice comparison. Good. So we're using the archive. I did a elaborate set of caveats the other day, but here's the quick caveats, right? Is that when you're doing corpus linguistics, the choice of which text you're looking at obviously makes like a lot of decisions about what kind of results you get, right? So by choosing the archive, we're obviously choosing mostly professional mathematicians communicating their preprints in mostly English, and we had a few other language results that we were excluding from the thing because we were studying English, right? I don't need to overemphasize like this is like choosing particular practices to study and excluding others, right? Obviously, I mentioned we only did this 4 months of 2009. Maybe you think that 2024 maths is wildly different from 2009 maths. I don't expect so, but there might be changes over time. It also is contemporary maths, not historical maths. It's also lots of things. It's written mathematics rather than spoken mathematics. It's not the mathematics in the classroom or anything like that. It's also not textbooks, though. I mentioned that Keith Weber has got a nice paper out where he does the same study, but for a specific textbook. So he looks at one textbook and finds mostly similar patterns. So I would say it generalizes to an extent that. Good. All right, so what we're interested in looking at then is three things about imperatives in these papers. The first one is, well, do they show up a lot or not very often, right? So the frequency of these things. The second one is, it would be possible for them to show up a lot because a small minority of people are really hardcore about writing loads of imperatives. So we want to know about like how broad the use of imperatives are, right? Whether it's like a small number of people or if like lots of papers contain this. Finally, we're interested in like the words themselves, which instructions are being given, like how diverse are the instructions. So I've got some things to say about all of those. Right. One challenge when we started this is that, of course, we're interested in instructions in mathematics. If I just took a generic list of instructions like that included cooking recipes, then I would have a whole lot of words that will never show up in mathematics. So we did a little bit of work to pick out some like likely candidates of words that might show up as imperatives in mathematics to focus on those in our ones. So what I've shown you here on the left-hand side is the sort of likely. Okay. We took the top 500 words in the corpus, like by frequency, and then I selected out every single one that could possibly be an imperative. That's what I did. The ones on the left are the ones that we sort of assumed were the likely candidates to be actual imperatives almost all the time. The one in the middle are the ones that will sometimes be used in imperatives and sometimes not, as a sort of first guess. So, and the ones on the right were the ones that could, in theory, be instructions, but in the maths case, will almost always be not imperative. So if you imagine sequence, right, like I can tell you, like, sequence these things for me, right? That's an imperative instruction. But if you're looking at maths texts, if someone's talking about a sequence, you're probably not talking about it in that way. Good. So we've got some results for the first two columns. We left out the right-hand ones. Now, the next challenge is how to know that the verbs we've picked out are giving instructions rather than something else. And we came up with like what I find quite a cunning operationalization, which is that we looked at those verbs but capitalized. So we put it on case sensitive, and if it's capitalized, then it's going to show up at the start of a sentence. So suppose with a capital S will almost always be a sentence starting with suppose, and then it's in the imperative mood, right? So that works nicely. And now not an imperative, if we were to suppose and then it doesn't have a capital letter, that's good, right? Now, of course, this does lead to like potentially missing some things, right? If you write a sentence like first, suppose that, that's also in the imperative mood, but we've missed it out in our thing. So it's not perfect, but we'll see it does a pretty solid job. So results. Here's the frequencies per million words of the sort of left-hand column of ones. And what you see is that by far the most common is let, right? And that shows up an awful lot. Let is like way more popular, right? We have let in a lot of proofs, and it shows up a lot in the corpus. But we also, in the paper, we describe how there's also kind of a gang of regularly used verbs. So the top left-hand column, the suppose, note, consider, assume, recall, define, fix, denote, observe, choose, take, all show up a lot within the proofs. Write as well, and maybe even think apply, use, for. It's worth noting for anyone that was at the interesting and important talk I gave the other day, but these are like way more, way higher per million words than all of the things we saw like for important and interesting. So as a comparative there. I suppose the other relevant result is that, well, we've got a big number per million words. Does this tell us anything? We could compare it to the non-proof bits, so the bits of maths papers that weren't proofs, all the other stuff. And we still find that they show up quite a lot there, but a bit less, right? And so that's the result, that even within other bits of mathematical text, there we go, large effect size that within proofs, they show up a lot. Good. So that's the frequency question. The breadth question of like, do they appear broadly? Is this just like a few cranks that only write in imperatives the whole time? Well, we can look at the percentage of files things show up in. And so that's the left-hand side. And as expected, let shows up in almost every file that has proofs at all. That is extremely common in proofs, but the other ones also quite a lot. It struck me when writing it that devoid of context, those percentages don't say much. So what I've got on the right-hand side is that I picked a word with like a similar breadth in other things. So like note shows up 45% of the time in proof text. Is that common? Well, it shows up as often as the word function in mathematics. So that's quite a lot, right? As broadly across these. And similarly, you can look at, well, define shows up as often as broadly as simple. And to my mind, these seem like words that I expect to show up quite a lot in maths papers. So these have a similar span across papers there. So I think this hopefully gives you a feeling for how broad. Oh yeah, I've done the whole table there. We don't need that. Cool. So once we've done that with our sort of most likely candidates, we also were interested in diversity, right? The diversity of instructions in proof texts. So we went back to that middle column, the ones where we're like, well, this could be used in instruction, but maybe not all the time. And we went and like by hand looked for these. And basically the upshot was that for all of them, we found examples of them being used as instructions. So I've picked out some of the clearest versions. So set the total degree equal to the sum of the bidegrees, form the cumulative cube, etc. Sum the estimates in the previous corollary, estimate the difference on the right-hand side of the triangle inequality to find. So in terms of diversity, if you go digging for instructions in these texts, you will also find them, right? And not just the same ones every time. Other ones can be there as well. So there's our full middle column of maybes and examples for all of them. Some of them get a bit hard to read because of the inline math stuff, but they're all in the imperative form. Okay, what do we learn? Well, the results show us that the most common imperatives show up frequently and broadly across maths research articles from 2009 on the archive, and that it's also possible to find diverse examples of imperatives using less common verbs. Right? Right. The upshot is, right, that we should take the existence of instructions in proofs very seriously. We should reject this Ganasalium line or the general idea of proofs are sequences of assertions. If we go and look at proofs as they're written, that's not true, right? Full stop. It might be sometimes, but it's not like generally the case. What's also interesting from our paper is that we actually get a sort of a sense of which instructions are being used more often, which I think is useful for plenty of things. I'll come back to that in the education bit later. Okay, so that's the language bit finished with. Let me move on to a completely different thing. And going for it. Right. Diagrams are like one of our favorites as like people doing mathematical practice because they're sort of a problem child in mathematics, right? Here's a proof from Matthew and Pablo Mejia Ramos saying, right, the common view of the role of the visual representation play in mathematics, i.e. that pictures may be useful heuristic tools, which suggest that ways of understanding proofs, but they are nevertheless inappropriate when it comes to providing unequivocal, reliable evidence to support a mathematical claim, let alone providing a proof. Now, of course, there's plenty of people that have shown, again, that this isn't right. Like the work that I mentioned by Sylvia and Valeria very much goes against this. I've got a real love of like fun little recreational maths, visual proofs. And I think that they can be proofs proper. So this is what I'm defending. This is the sum of the first n odd integers that it goes to n squared. So if you, of the first n positive integers, missed a positive there. So this is a very ancient visual proof where, of course, you start with 1, add 3, add 5, add 7, etc. And you see that it's always a square. Right? Now, there is a super nice Stanford Encyclopedia article by Marcus Giaquinto where he talks about visual understanding in mathematics. And somewhere in there is the like, here's the reasons people don't like visual proofs. Number one, right? There's some famous cases of misleading diagrams, such as like the usual one is the like all triangles or isosceles triangles. If you've not seen it, it's worth Googling and have a look. It's a nice tricksy case. The second reason is that diagrams can only show special cases, so they can't be properly general, right? You would say this isn't a proof, this is n equals 7 and nothing more, right? And finally, there's the one that's related to this proofs as sequences of assertions idea, which is that it's hard to take a diagram and figure out which assertions are being made, right? Here's a very blasé statement. I think the first one is a rubbish criticism. We don't think that written proofs are not proofs because there's a few like fallacies or a few misleading written proofs. I don't think that same reasoning can be used for diagrams at all. So that one sucks. The other two are closely related. I'm going to talk about the other two in a second. I think the diagrams work very nicely with the recipe model of proofs in the following way, right? That diagrams can provide instructions in ways everyone is familiar with from day-to-day life, right? If you have lived in the last few years, you have lived by following some instructions at some point, right? I have a young kid. We do a lot of Lego. If you look at instructions for doing Lego, right, my 4-year-old can do this, and this is more complicated than some like mathematical diagrams that supposedly aren't rigorous, right? Right, we see like a lot of elements in common between instructions like this and visual mathematical proofs. So we've got a list of pieces that you need for this particular step. I think this is a Star Wars snow speeder. And we get like a bit of like putting things together and then how you add them onto the main thing. So it's like almost like a subproof or a sublemma and then adds on to the main thing. We've got another subproof over here. If you look, there's these tiny little red arrows. I don't know if it's clear, but like they're pointing at places. So there's like a dynamic aspect to these diagrams. This one even more so, it's like dynamic. It's like this thing goes onto those two back pieces. Similarly, people always say, oh, I can't do IKEA. It's so confusing. It's so hard. I think the people that make IKEA instructions are like geniuses at visual communication without any like written languages. I think doing IKEA furniture is awesome. I'm not sponsored by IKEA, but if anyone here works for IKEA and wants to sponsor me, I will happily do on research projects on IKEA instructions. Okay. Oh, yeah. They're not the worst. They're not the worst. Right. Again, I picked out one here with some special properties. Right here is two people need to work together to do something. You need to hold it here. You need to hold it here. Both of the people are doing parts of the actions, but it shows you up close how to do this. There's do this twice. There's a rotational aspect of it. You need to do it this way around. It tells you not to use this thing. Don't be tempted to get your Allen key out. Don't use that one. Right. Again, right. If you're building that bed, you've got no mathematical training, you can still build your bed. Right? It's not that hard. Good. Right, similar elements show up in visual proofs, right? Here's a favorite, like one of my favorite Pythagoras proofs, where you take a triangle and you inflate it, so by the length of the hypotenuse on one side, inflate it by the A and the B, and then combine those two. And the point is to realize that these end up as the same size triangle, they mirror images of each other, except one has the c squared hypotenuse and one has a squared plus b squared. I think that's a very nice proof. This comes from the Proofs Without Words books, and because they're recreational mathematics, right, there is a question of quite how rigorous they are, because part of the fun is figuring out how it works exactly, right? And I think this one, the key step it's missing, which is like, I guess trivial, but there's like a bit about making sure that these angles add up to a right angle triangle down there, which I suppose is trivial once I've said it, but you see that this is like an important part of the proof, because otherwise your triangles, it's not going to end up the same. Here's my favorite proof from those whole books, is what I call a proof by Gestalt switch, where you're looking at the sum of X numbers are cubes. Maybe I won't go into this. Everyone wants to look at it. I'm happy to talk about it at length. So I didn't know what hex numbers were before you open up that page, but then he gives you an example of how to build them. And then the trick to the proof to show that they'll sum up to cubes is to like do this gestalt shift of showing like, okay, well, I look at this, but if I map it back into the three-dimensional thing that you see on the side here, but you see that those two are the same. And this is like the outer layer of a cube. And then there's implicitly an induction going on. And so you can like build up bigger and bigger cubes every time you add a hex number. So this is like a switch between ways of seeing, right? I love that proof. If anyone wants to look at it more later, I'll get it up for you as well. Cool, right, as I said, right? I don't know if Sylvia agrees with all the stuff I'm saying, but this was an inspiration for this, right? Like if you look at their papers, you find like a lot of the like similar talk of like actions, right? So moreover, we can proceed from one representation to another by applying actions that are permissible, i.e. allowed and controlled by the shared practice of the subfields. They've got this beautiful diagram from Rolfson where he's brought a little picture of a knife to indicate the cutting, which is like one of the best finds in philosophy of all time. It's wonderful. But to my mind, this is like indicating an instruction, a set of instructions to do. On the recipe model of proof, diagrams and other ways of presenting proofs don't form some kind of like special mystery like they do for the standard model. We're not looking at these and going, oh, what's the assertions underlying here, right? Extracting instructions is pretty straightforward, I say. We understand diagrams, they both provide certain pieces of information, but also instructions for what we need to be doing. So you're not exactly like picking out assertions and trying to figure out the order they're in, like you're getting these things at the same time and seeing the instructions that need to be carried. Right, I've already said this. So I think the interesting thing to study is the pragmatics of how these features work. Like the proofs about words books have all kinds of different ways that instructions are done. We often get sort of tricked into thinking that proofs are all just like proof by induction or by contradiction or by cases or by brute force calculation or something. But visual proofs like this, I think, are a rich source of other ways that proofs can be done. There's not been so much more. Okay. That's what I have to say about diagrams. So now let me link the recipe model to something about epistemology of proofs. So the distinction I'm interested in is a classic one in analytic epistemology, probably coming from Gilbert Ryle, though there's plenty of dispute about that. And it's the difference between knowledge how and knowledge that. Gilbert Ryle has a very nice way of writing. So it's like you get a lot of nice quotes from him, but there's other people that said these things. Right. So the idea is that knowledge how to do things is a kind of practical knowledge, whereas knowledge that is a propositional kind of knowledge. So Joe knows that the angles in a triangle add up to 180 degrees is a piece of propositional knowledge, whereas Caroline knows how to construct an equilateral triangle is a piece of practical knowledge. So one thing that shows up in Ryle's work is that the practical knowledge fits more naturally with imperative style sentences and verb forms. Yeah, so it fits more naturally with the kind of verb form of mathematical proving as well, right? So the claim I'm going to make is that if proofs in mathematics are recipes for actions, then we ought to know how to carry out those actions as well, right? That this links to a knowledge how involved in doing proofs. So Ryle is like very strong in his what he calls the anti-intellectualist approach that these like bits of knowledge how don't reduce knowledge of propositions. So says things like not knowing a rule of inference is not possessing a bit of extra information, but being able to perform an intelligent operation. Right? So he doesn't dig into mathematics very much, but this is like clearly applicable there. This also links to the language I've been talking about. So he says, we certainly can, in respect of many practices like fishing, cooking, and reasoning, extract principles from their applications by people who know how to fish, cook, and reason. Hence Isaac Walton, Mrs. Beeton, and Aristotle. I think these references have not aged well. It's to look up what these are, right? But when we try to express these principles, we find they cannot easily be put into the indicative mood. They fall automatically into the imperative mood. So, this mention of know-how, I guess the paper that got me into mathematical practice, this Yehuda Rav paper, is talking all about how proof is where all the real stuff is, right? And at some point in there, he says this final thing, the entire mathematical know-how is embedded in proofs. And he never talks about knowing how, knowing that distinction, but like clearly implicit in there is like a thought about the practical versus the proposition. So on the recipe model, a proof involves giving a sequence of giving instructions and not just a sequence of assertions. So the knowledge from proofs, I think, is partially practical rather than just purely proposition. Okay. So I think to prove some theorem or to follow a proof requires knowledge how and can generate new knowledge. Proofs can use the imperatives that we saw in the language bit to tell us which actions to carry out, how to go about doing the reasoning. And something I've written that's maybe more detailed than I should go into here, but like mathematical knowledge requires like enacting some of these activities. So to have like the true, like the good flavor of mathematical knowledge, you actually need to go through and do some of these actions, whether they're cognitive or inferential or scribbling on paper or something like this. And okay, maybe I don't want to go too deep in that, but I think that there is the point where we find like the actual link between a proof that's there on the page and like how we get mathematical knowledge out of it is that it's telling us to do some stuff and we have to do it. And once we've done some stuff, then we can know things, right? It's maybe slogan form of this, right? Right, the emphasis on epistemology falls very naturally from the recipe model. Right, the big change is to see the activity as proving as the epistemically primary thing, proofs themselves as secondary. So where the proofs aren't really the way we get knowledge, it's by like taking the proofs and like doing some activities of proving, right? And this was mentioned in the talk you guys gave yesterday as well, right? The proofs themselves record and communicate these activities that need to be carried out. Like the recipes, right? And it's now repeating myself. But what we want is when we read a proof, right? We want that an author has hopefully carried out all the proof and all the activities and presents this as a way to do the same thing. And if we read the proof and kind of repeat some of these steps, which is of course easier than coming up with it ourselves, then this is the right way to do it. We get good. I've got some like analytic epistemology stuff for you here, which I maybe will go quickly over. The picture I think is needed for mathematics is quite close to work by Jennifer Hornsby and by David Wiggins. Both of them emphasize like the close connection between practical and propositional knowledge. So right, where I've been emphasizing the actions, I've been emphasizing the instructions. Proofs clearly aren't just sequences of instructions by themselves, right? They do involve assertions too, right? So proofs do combine bits of declarative and bits of imperative sentences. And so what we get is like a mix of activities that need to be carried out with some statements of facts that follow from what we've done or well-known facts that are being drawn on beforehand, and like what's achieved by doing various things. So I think that the epistemic picture that should fall out of this should combine bits of practical knowledge of mathematical activities with bits of propositional knowledge of premises and intermediate steps. So we want a mix like that. Here, there's a nice quote by David Wiggins about a ship's pilot sailing large ships into the harbor, and he's got a lot of competence and experience, so he uses those to tell us that when the wind is from the north and the tide is running out, the best thing to do is to steer straight for such and such a church tower until one is well past a bend in the channel. He says, almost anyone can come to possess that propositional knowledge, but the information they get in this way will probably rest indispensably upon the experience and practical knowledge of a handful of people with different kinds of propositional, with different kinds of knowledge, namely practical or agential knowledge. The point being that the propositional knowledge that we get in mathematics comes about from previous bits of practical knowledge, and often vice versa, right? These two whereas I want to present some knowing how stuff, like I think they're kind of inseparable, right? In a sort of big picture way. Cool. So in just the same way, our mathematical knowledge is tied to our know-how, our skills, our competence and ability. When I'm doing this work, this is where I link it to the other work I've done with Colin and Andrew on virtues and mathematical virtues, right? That this, the virtue epistemology literature like borders into this sort of stuff. So things about competence and abilities is like one end of the virtue epistemology literature. So mathematical activities that lead to knowledge depend on knowing how to do them. Okay, I've oversaid this. All right, getting it. Okay, the final bit I wanted to do, and all right, yeah, good. Fine. Is just like a few words about the maths education implications. This is a paper I did with Keith Weber, who is maths education research primarily, but also has work in a lot of empirical work about philosophy that you probably have seen quoted by anyone who's interested in empirical work on philosophy of maths. He also does some mathematics work, very broad things. Right, I've given you a whole lot of stuff about instructions, imperatives, knowledge how. It turns out, right, that is going to be relevant for how you teach mathematics, right? And there's like some really like clear slogans, right? The first relevant point is that when you're teaching proofs, if you're teaching the language used in proofs, right, if we conceptualize proofs as sequences of assertions, if that's the way we're thinking about them, and we're wrong about that, right, then we're going to miss out on important aspects of proving when we teach our students that proofs are sequences of assertions, right? Right? The point being that if you tell them that proofs are one thing and then show them proofs that are a different thing, that is confusing if you're trying to learn what you're doing in mathematics, right? It also means that when you get all of those instructions, all those imperatives that we found in the language bit, right? If you don't even talk about those in part of your education, then understanding how they work is left to like entirely like as an implicit bit of like learning, right? There's no like explicit instruction on this is how you structure a proof for this thing, this is how you structure a proof for this thing. Right, so here's a question for everyone. What's the difference between the instructions, let's suppose, assume, consider, fix, and take, right? And I bet all of you could have a decent go at saying what those are. But I don't necessarily think that a first-year undergraduate could have a good take at like what the difference is between those, right? And maybe easier than letting them over 3 or 4 years trying to implicitly pick up on the difference of those things, maybe it's better to show them the difference between those things, right? It has a slogan, if you want students to learn the answer, maybe you should teach the answer. Okay. The way that someone evaluates a recipe is also different from how one evaluates a sequence of assertions, right? The sort of traditional sequence of assertions view, right? You want to ask things like, well, is this assertion true? Does it follow from the previous steps? And we have to teach students to do this sort of stuff. I'm teaching intro logic. We do this sort of things all the time, right? But if you're presented with a mixture of assertions and instructions, right? The recipes model, like there's a lot more like nuanced questions you need to ask. Like, what actions am I being asked to carry out? Can I carry out this step? Do I know how to? It's the epistemic bit. Does it produce the outcome that the author claims it's going to do? Does it guarantee the right properties for carrying on the proof? Right? So there's a lot of questions that come with those sort of things. And those aren't trivial because something I've not really gone into is that some of the instructions that we're given in proofs are like you do them directly, right? But other times, like instructions are used in like kind of weird and quirky ways. And a very nice example that Benedict Löwe said to me, right, is that if you are doing a set theory proof and it says to use the axiom of choice to choose this set, right? Like using the axiom of choice is precisely because you're unable to do the choosing, right? So you need to understand that the choosing isn't something you're not going to like, okay, let's list them all out and do a choice every time, because then you'd be busy infinitely long, right? The whole point of that instruction is that you need to understand that you're not following that explicit instruction, but you're doing a different kind of activity, right? So that is hard to know if you're a student. So what me and Keith said is that proof pedagogy should explicitly teach students how to use these instructions appropriately and correctly, rather than presenting a model that assumes they don't exist. Good. The final bit, if you dig into our paper, we have a lot to say about like different levels of understanding a recipe proof. Like you might understand the like literal meaning of how to execute the steps, execute the recipe. But this is like not the same as being able to justify why it will always be possible to execute the recipe, right? So that requires a different level of understanding. It's also different from being able to justify why the output following from the recipe has the specified mathematical properties. And even more so, like it's not the same as interpreting the recipe as a goal-directed recipe. We saw mention yesterday of the work by Yesin Hamami and Becky Morris on sort of rationality and proof things. And I think this is sort of where this ties into what Keith and I are saying, right? There's a particular kind of understanding of proofs. Good. Okay, that is the end from me. I just wanted to show you at the end my favorite proof by imperative. Here's all this, proof, think. All right, the end.
Thank you, Fenner, for this very clear and inspiring talk. I see many hands, so I think I'm going to go down this way. So Juliet first, then Andrea, then you, and then Matteo. And then we'll continue there. Ah, scusa Marco, non ti ha visto. Includerò.
Yeah, is this working?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Fenner. So this remark of Benedict made me think, I mean, I don't think it's quite correct. The point is you can't make a choice in a definable way,
Yeah.
right? But I mean, with the axiom of choice, we get all kinds of pathologies and undefinable sets and so on. But that actually opens the door to something very interesting because all these imperatives, I'm sure there's a mixture of doing, you know, carrying this out in a definable way and carrying this out just axiom of choice, you know, leading on into sets, taking an element from each set. You know, I'm sure there's something like that going on with a lot of this narrative.
Yeah.
Instruction. So that, you know, just from a logical point of view, it would be interesting to dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. That's a nice question. So I put it on the list of implications and then skipped out on this. If you look at some of the classic papers on the logic of imperatives, there's a few like there's been quite a literature on this, right? But some of the early papers they say like, oh, imperatives are very common, and then they list like, you know, go to school, and then always a mathematical one in there. And at no point have I seen like any like detailed like analysis of mathematical imperatives that has followed from any of these logics at all. And so I wonder if the reason is that the mathematical case is like too tricky because there's precisely these issues that emerge from it or something. Yeah.
Marco, I don't know how I didn't see you, but
I think that we to discuss this topic because it's called the astronomical Platonism. By far,
I've seen
that's
it.
the book that I never wrote. It's a book of recipes. I know how to write the recipes. And so, and I think that exactly the analogies in and the recipe, even if I think that the recipe is not at all what you describe it is, but that's another story. When we discuss, and when we will have the conference in philosophy of cooking, we discuss it, and now we have conference in philosophy of mathematics. I think certainly there are analogies, but there are fundamental differences that cannot be forgotten. The first fundamental one is that the end of the recipe, what you have is an object, it's a dish. At the end of the group, unless you are very strange from formulas, that I think you don't know, what you have is clay, it's not just the same. Clay takes something is well. fundamental. The recipe, the proof take place in a second. It's imperative that you say something that is not permitted. So you cannot tell me something that is not permitted by the second, which is the art, as is in fundamental, the proof spot. Here, something love. And the third fundamental. And the third even fundamental difference is that if at the end of the recipe, the dish that you do is not well done, you will be better next time. If the proof, the theorem is not well established, you are simply not with the proof. So think of this. These are the fundamental differences that made that looking at the recipe strongly. And let me finish two remarks. So one that I also think that are very important imperative is also mathematics. The first imperative is speaks about mathematics. This is to me an imperative that should be followed in a context of philosophy of mathematics. Speak about mathematics, not mathematics. And the last thing that you began to say that philosophy of mathematical practice movement challenge the formal misconception of proof. I agree with you, but I have to choose between that and Hilbert, so I am on the side of Hilbert.
Oh, that's yeah, it's I mean, I could have said all of this without an analogy to guide it, right? Like it's an analogy, it's a metaphor that is instructive in some ways and not in others. When I write this stuff, the way that I use the metaphor is that when you do a recipe, then you get your cake at the end, and if you follow a mathematical proof, then you get mathematical knowledge at the end. And that's the analytic epistemology in me, epistemologist in me wants to get something like that. Yeah. I've forgotten your second point. I also had something to say on this. What the
It's great. Cooking is something that can be done.
yeah. Well, that's true. I mean, so the upshot is, right, like this point that if you've not done well at your proof, then in the end it's not a proof, right? Like there's a sense in which that's true, right? Like in the published papers, that's certainly true. But if you have students, right, like they can repeatedly have a go at proofs, and even if they're not producing proofs the whole time, they might be getting closer and closer to it. So there's also like a level of practice in doing these things that's there. Yeah. But yeah, beyond that, I mean, I don't want to go like too deep in defending a metaphor. It's a metaphor that I think is instructive in a lot of ways, but yeah, there's certainly disanalogies as well.
So I have 7 people, so please be
very quick. Yes. Can I ask you that, have you tried in some, at least some sample proof, to rephrase the pragmatic language? So to avoid let's, suppose, and some, so rather than let n be a real number, it would be n is a real number. Rather than extend the line, you rephrase with L is the extended line, and see where the content breaks up. So that if there's a point in which the pragmatic language is indispensable or unavoidable to get across content, which is not get across by the paraphrase. That's
that's nice. So we have done some stuff like that, and when you take instructions and get rid of them, you paraphrase them as assertions. It ends up sounding way more clunky and awkward, right? This is like, I suppose the sort of traditional conception of what to do with these things is that like, oh, well, they're just like a fancy way of saying, really it's just an assertion. And so you can just paraphrase them away, you translate them into assertion language, and then you end up with a nice sequence of assertions, and all of this isn't that important. One thing I like to say to that is that you can also translate all the assertions into imperatives and get rid of all the assertion language, and then be done with all of that and just have this one, right? Like it goes both ways in these things. Like, translation, though, is always like it can always lead you astray, right? Translation is not just like a mapping, is not just a function. I think like translating each different way like emphasizes different things. So right, like translating away all these instructions, like it makes it like way harder to read. It makes it immediately clunkier. But it does emphasize like something about like logical structure. You get something much closer to classical first order logic type reasoning, or something that looks like it could formalize it, at least in some respect. Whereas if you go the other way, you end up with something that looks more like a proof in a textbook that's actually trying to teach students what they're doing, right? The more you look into textbooks, I think textbooks tend to have like more of these instructional languages because they think it's like somehow more accessible for students. So, yeah. And there, right, like, you know, I suppose the other thing to say about translating away instructions and what happens where it breaks down is that there's like different classes of instructions, right? Like, I guess the way I've phrased it, it's a lot about like the very explicit instructions to go and do things, but quite a lot of these imperatives are working in a way that is what like Brian Rotman talks about, like constructing a shared space. So these things like the let's this and this, or fix this, or take one of these, and even like supposes and assumes where you're feeding in background assumptions. They're like setting up the space within which you're doing mathematics, right? And by taking those from the imperative form into the assertion form, like it's it de-emphasizes that like constructing bit. It's like, oh, we already live in this space or something, and then that's like harder to get into if you don't already live in that space, right? I guess that's it.
Thank you. So this is a related question to the previous one. So I noticed that in your list of imperatives that show up a lot, you do see a lot of these supposed let. You don't actually see very much of your titular like add it up or like multiply this. And it's this question emphasized there are these imperatives like suppose and let do have this kind of relatively easy translatability into perhaps a logical or note might be a way of saying like reintroducing an assertion or something like that. And kind of analogously with the diagrammatic case, I noticed your examples with say the sum of odd numbers making a square, or also with those whatever the surface of the cubes. All of those look like they were showing a universal statement. Like you could easily read a universal out of that, like, oh, if you add up the odd numbers, for any odd number of odd numbers you're adding up, it's going to make a square. Whereas the IKEA or the Lego analogy looks more like they're constructing an object, which of course we do in math, but those weren't the examples that you used. So it seems like both in terms of the language case and in terms of the diagrammatic case, the examples that are most analogous to say the recipe or the Lego are not really the ones that seem to show up as often.
This is a nice point. Brian Rotman doesn't have any data on this, but in that like 80s book that I mentioned, just after he says, oh yeah, texts are full of imperatives, he gives like a whole paragraph of instructions precisely like the ones like the add it up and the multiply, derive, integrate, do these things. And in our corpus linguistics paper, we took all of the ones he had and looked at how common they were. And they mostly, again, like the diversity point stands that they mostly showed up, but bam, like not so much, right? Yeah, the way he's thinking of these instructions doesn't really reflect the way that those papers are written. It's possible, of course, that he's like thinking more in terms of like some other thing, like maybe textbooks, or maybe he's thinking about classroom mathematics, what you do when you're in a seminar or with students, all these things. Yeah, one thing to say to this, so that makes it seem like I've painted a false picture. We do get plenty of like the exclusive imperatives. It's not like it's all just let and suppose and assume, right? There's plenty of other ones that aren't there. Keith Weber's like follow-up paper where he studied the textbook finds a mixture of all of those things. So it's not like it's all one thing and all another thing. He also finds like other versions of imperatives. So like there's lots of like in his textbooks, there's a lot of like see this, where it's like look at a different theorem in the book to see this. So that's another kind of instruction and like another thing to go and do. Yeah, so right, the picture of instructions that emerges from the language side then is one where it's doing like it's got lots of functions, right? It's got the sort of functions of constructing the space, and it's got the functions of like telling you to do stuff within that space. And yeah, within the data, I think you see both of those things there. I think the reason that the constructing the space ones are more common, well, firstly, it's because let is so extremely common that it like shifts everything in that direction. But also that these play like a bigger role in like standard forms of writing, right? And that goes maybe towards the educational point that these are like standard structures for starting an argument involve some of these words, which is what makes them more common. And if you want students to know how to do that, then you should show these. Yeah, the point about the diagrams, right? Like, again, I showed some that were somewhat more universal, where you're also like reading stuff that comes from like this sum of odd numbers. I showed the n=7 case. One thing I think about these diagrams is that if you understand that diagram, you also understand that it's implicitly an induction and you see what the induction step is, right? And so that's maybe the disagreement with they only show a special case, not the generality. If you don't understand why that diagram is general, then you've not understood that diagram properly. The analogy to the IKEA and the Lego, I guess those were like more specific things, but the way I'm imagining those is that those are like steps in one long chain of diagrams that do these things. And I cut out a slide where I showed a few more proofs, but you do see those in like proofs without words. You see ones with multiple steps where you have to do more things. And I suppose I'm thinking of the analogy to like particular steps. Right? I've probably got it hidden. There's like a diagram where you're moving some boxes around to show areas of the same, right? Like maybe it's a subplot of that. So to my mind, yeah, I see the point that it's like a difference in levels, but I don't think that breaks down the analogy. It's fine.
Oh, sorry. It's just starting proofs, but when you type parentheses, okay, but it still works maybe that breaks up when you type something like contradiction or using the accent function.
This is a nice question, right? Because there is like some very clear like thematic similarities to constructivism. I think it's like a very sensible question to ask. The way I'm thinking of it is not at all as making a constructivist assumption by these instructions that you find in there. I think I'm considering them in a more general way than the constructivist would, such that I think you see the same like instructional languages within proofs by contradiction as you do anywhere else. So the constructivist would reject something like that, but I don't see any reason to, right? I'm not proposing to be revisionary in the same way that Brouwer would be. So there's clearly like a constructivist influence on like seeing these, especially once you dig into what the actions are. I've got a section in the little book about like what kind of actions are these, and like thinking about those actions in some sort of constructivist sense is like maybe one of the options. But I think there's other options, right? We can think about cognition or epistemic actions, or Giorgio Venturi has written a more recent paper about like these are speech acts, which is another option. I don't think it's the right option, but it's like another way of doing it. So there's lots of options of these things, and I don't think it has to just be constructivist. Yeah, this is a sensible question to ask.
So we're moving to the other side of the room, just so you know. I have William first, then Michael, then Ladislav, and then Jenna.
Thanks, Henry. So I'm wondering if your picture can shed any light on the value of different groups seeing results, which I think is kind of mysterious on the standard picture, but it's not completely obvious that it's less mysterious on your picture. Like if you think of the goal of the activity as ultimately getting knowledge, what is the point of having different ways of getting the same knowledge? One suggestion that occurs to me is how the activities that we value, some of them we value primarily because of the result that they produce. Some of them we value primarily because of the skill that we develop in doing the very activity itself. And maybe one way to think about the value of different groups of the same result for you is that we're sort of mastering a different skill or learning a different activity when we master a different group.
Yeah.
Does that seem plausible to you?
Yeah, that seems like a lovely answer to your question. I hadn't thought about that specifically, and yeah, I think what you've just said seems like a very good first go at an answer.
Okay, thanks to me then.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Great work.
I very much like this model of recipe. Recipes. I think it is faithful to mathematical practice and particularly to the conversation among mathematicians, the platform which I think could be taken as a paradigmatic moment of mathematical practice rather than a printed theorem. But I want to complicate this a little bit. I looked up some proofs in other languages I noticed. So in French, for example, French is the place let is swab but with a T rather than S, so that it's imperative but to in the third person. No less common is first person plural imperatives, which I also found in an Italian text that I was able to look up, and it's a little bit more complicated in German. It's also in third person imperative. On the other hand, in recipes, for some reason in French, the typical imperative is in the infinitive, whereas I looked up a recipe in German, and it's ambiguous as to whether it's second person plural imperative or third person plural or in the infinitive. So I think that the technicalities of the grammar are somehow less important than the fact that there is an imperative mood that permeates the proof for the actual at the blackboard. I also want to mention to the prevalence of transitive verbs in mathematical proofs, which if these were merely assertion, there would be absolutely no reason for verbs for actions of any kind to be taken. So this is anyway. I'm very happy that you're developing this.
Thank you. Yeah. The question of other languages is yeah, an excellent one, right? And I said with the corpus linguistics, I was doing it in English, and it tells us something about English language mathematics. And yeah, you're absolutely right that right. What's the general thing we learn from this? Well, like mathematics is written in a way that like follows all kinds of like norms and conventions, and different languages have different norms and conventions. So we've learned something about the English norms and conventions for writing by studying linguistics. And maybe that's like somewhat separate from the other stuff about the epistemology or the diagrams of how these work, right? It's like those two things can come apart. I suppose if we'd done this corpus linguistics and found no imperatives at all, I might have still gone on and written the other bits of stuff about the epistemology and buried my results, right? Might have done something like that. Yeah, there's lots to be said about like the structure of these instructions. So you're absolutely right. Different languages do it differently. And something, again, Benedict has picked me up on is that he thinks that treating let as an imperative is like a misreading of what's going on. That if you look at the etymology in the other languages, the let is an optative that just happens to fall into like imperative form in English, right? Now, it doesn't really change the results. If I struck out let at the top of those things, I could have given the whole same talk, but like the insight of that, right, is that you're using the imperative mood to do lots of things in English mathematics. What I was saying before, right, about constructing this shared space and then like following actions that come through it. And What I like to imagine, right, is that like you're reading a maths proof and it says like let G be a group, and you go like, no, I don't want to, man. You can't make me, right? There's something like weird about that, right? Because it's like following the instructions, it's not like a choice you have like within the proof, right? The thing is that you're like deciding to want to go through these things, and then you go through like the activities that it's prescribing. It's not like the same thing as no. It's like other like eat your greens. It's like no, I want a hamburger. It's like different ways that language can be used. But yeah, and then yeah, I do appreciate the point that like the sort of activity-based stuff more generally in like how mathematicians talk to each other is very important. I see Ursula's online. I used to work on her project, and the other person on that project was called Lorenzo Lane, and he did a wonderful detailed ethnography of mathematicians, a lot of it like interactions at the blackboards, and the findings from that I think are very in line with what you're saying. There's a lot of talking to one another in these things and turn taking, and he's got lots of rich details that I couldn't do justice now. But yeah, I think there is also a very different kind of evidence towards those things that backs up your experience.
Let Ladislav have the word.
Thank you for an interesting talk, and I would like to support what you are doing by experience. We went to Euclid with a friend and looked up all the works in Euclid and how are they placed.
Lovely.
You see that they are in passive mode.
Yeah.
Except one word, and it is Lego. I play. So Euclid is actively playing, but everything else is already done and already reflecting, etc. Of course, this is a Platonistic influence, so he's changing the verb, but basically the same structure or similar structure appears already in Euclid, so that there are verbs and there is actually not a recipe because in the Platonist, so everything is already done, but it was sometimes done. So maybe it would be interesting to go with this methodology to Euclid, to Al-Khwarizmi, and all these objects.
Yeah, I think maybe this already answers the earlier question about like when does stuff get like when does it break down if you move from instruction to assertions, right? Euclid gets a lot easier to read if you're reading it that way than there's like lists of like assertions and propositions. I think that the project you're describing is already there in the work of Victor Blasio on, I think his like version of ancient Greek mathematics precisely is also picking up on this same trend in things. So I think he's got a very cool paper, and he's got a position. I can't think of the name right now, but yeah. So it's absolutely there, right? I think these studies of ancient Greek mathematics like show a similar thing going on. Yeah, you mentioned the Platonist, like in some versions of this, I get out a Plato quote. Somewhere in the Republic, he talks about the geometers and how they talk like practical men all doing things, when really they should be talking of the eternal and true knowledge, right? And so Plato hates this stuff. Every now and then I phrase this as if I'm like fighting against Plato, but yeah.
Gemma is next, but I'll take advantage of my position as chair just to insert one comment on this very thing that I had in mind. Proclus has this wonderful report on these two schools of mathematicians in Plato's school, exactly on the issue of the linguistic usage opposing Chrysippus to Menaechmus. Exactly, one going for a theorematic type of presentation of the material, the other one using construction language. And so it is quite interesting that this topic comes up already very early on. It's of course also discussed in a very interesting book by Lachterman called The Ethics of Geometry from 1989, where he reflects exactly on the type of things that Ladislav was bringing up, this use of the passive forms in the form of something having already been constructed and so on. So there is a very loaded, so to speak, history of these issues that somehow verges on the metaphysical. So it was just a comment, Gemma.
You send these to me?
Yeah, I will.
My question is maybe somewhat related. I was interested in the other 18% of the corpus that was not the majority. I mean, I'm just focusing on the highest percentage you have. But would you, I know corpus.
Papers with outlets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I know corpus linguistics focuses on the main trend, but I wondered if you identified any subpopulations who engaged in distinct writing styles that are perhaps less imperative, or if there's something else going on with a smaller proportion of that corpus.
Yeah, I actually think to the specific question about the other ones, because it's big data, like there's like some messiness. So I guess like of course some of those are proofs that just don't involve a let at all, but like a fair chunk of that 18% is like proofs that are like papers where there's only one proof and it's proof trivial, and then that counts as one of the papers, like that sort of stuff. So there's like some junk and some like trivial files that basically have nothing in them and something like that. But to your broader question of looking at subpopulations, I don't think we specifically have any data on that or anything like that, but I've spent quite a lot of time like just pulling up random papers on the archive, and of course you see like big variations in how like the stylistic approach to writing proofs from different people. Like clearly, like those breadth results are like proofs that, you know, like which percentage of proofs contain one instance of assume or suppose, right? And often those things are like, you know, assume shows up once or twice, and that's the end of it. And there's a lot of like assertion sequence, or there's often just like big chunks of calculation that we've left out as well. So it's certainly not true. You certainly don't get from these results like, oh, all the proofs out there all look like this, right? You just get that this is not like a non-existent field like we're arguing against. Plenty of proofs look like very austere and stark in the traditional way of sequences of assertions and interspersed with some calculations. So you certainly do get these things. So I don't have any like nice like, oh, here's this population, but it's like it's very clear looking at the archive even for a little bit that you do get like very broad differences in how people write proofs, which I suppose is obvious, but yeah, it's.
So we have time for one more question if anyone.
Make this a statement. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I think that there are like some interesting things to pull out from the metaphor of recipes, but also I'm a little bit worried that there are also some misleading things, and in particular with respect to diagrams, like this goes along with some questions we had before, like at the end of the idea thing, yeah, that thing, and in my experience, actually, I had misread the diagrams many times, and then I break the pieces, and I don't get the furniture correctly, and I have like something that tells me I did it correctly or not. And in that sense, it's more like a puzzle in the sense that Kenny was talking about. Yeah. So when I'm done, I know I'm correct. Maybe because the rest tastes well, or like because the table looks like a table and doesn't have unwanted holes or something. Yeah. Whereas in the case of diagrams, like you don't have that. And so I think there is a like important analogy there. Moreover, like of course I have a lot of imperatives and things we do, but at the end, like we are wanting to make inferences. So like changing the structure of our basing relation. So basing some beliefs on some other beliefs. And this is just not something that happens in the case of recipes. So also with respect to the education perspective of this, I mean, maybe it's nice to highlight certain kind of unconventional aspects of mathematical writing, but at the other hand, we should be careful not to forget the kind of more standard ones. Yeah. Yeah, I suppose I don't really like disagree with any of this, right? Like it's an analogy, right? And even in writing it, I say like here's how the analogy works, and here's some disanalogies that doesn't come out, right? I do think right, if you switch your activity from something physical, making stuff, to something cognitive, right? Like it's sort of trivial that then you don't get a thing at the end, right? That you get something else that's cognitive there at the end. So if you say, well, I've been doing some like actions, thinking about stuff, then at the end I've got a new thought. I think that like that's how analogies work, but right, like it doesn't have to be now I've done a lot of mathematical thinking and I have a
a table, right? Like, I think it's okay to have that. So, yeah, in terms of inferences, I think this was in the Ryle quote, right? Is that like inferences you can make by being instructed to do things in a certain way. So I don't think that switching to this way of thinking removes us from having to think about inferences. But it does broaden the class of things. So when Brendan was writing, right, he wrote about like proofs as classes of inferential actions or sets of inferential actions or something like this. And one thing that I've pulled them up on a little bit is that the kind of actions there are, some of them are inferential, but there's plenty of other kinds of actions you do. This is like constructing the space things. There's yeah, like all kinds of other stuff, and especially in diagrams, right? Like your own work shows that there's other kinds of actions that you do, like these manipulative imagination actions, right? They're not necessarily inferential all the time. They do other things too. So I think absolutely you can have inferences on this sort of model.
Are there announcements before we thank Fenner?
No, not
No?
for now.
Okay, so let's thank Fenner.
Thank you.
So warm.
Good, but like I always, I'm very reluctant to think about diagrams of the IKEA stuff. Maybe I'm thinking because, yeah, with the IKEA, it's like a puzzle that then you have the thing and you're like checking, okay, did it work or not? But with the, like, oh, in order for it to be action proof, you want to read its reliability directly. I don't know, it's kind of reminded me like.
Yeah.
In math, like you don't, you want also to be sure that you're right.
Yeah, don't you get this sometimes in like cooking as well? So on. Yeah.
I think it's okay.
Sometimes you're like,
You're asking that.
like, hey, I cooked this from a recipe, but I'm not sure if it's right. It tastes sort of weird.
That's what I thought. I mean, I thought you had that was in more of that response to Marco's question at the beginning, that I think that he was worried that there are that there's only certain things you're allowed to do in proofs. But I think if your recipe calls for someone to use blowtorch and they don't have a blowtorch, that's not a useful recipe for the person. Yeah. And I think on his point that if you follow the recipe not well and you don't get the right thing at the answer, that's I think like the person reading a proof not well. But that's not a problem with the proof. It would be a problem if you, and I think the analogy of a proof that's incorrect would be a recipe that's incorrect. And if this recipe is missing a step, or if the recipe tells you to saute the onions for 10 minutes and you actually need to do 30 minutes, then that's a problem with the recipe. It's not a problem with the person following it. And I think we got the same thing with the proof. Yeah.
That's a nice way of replying to this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you could have sort of held
the line.
Yeah.
Yeah. But ultimately, it's just a metaphor, and it's like it doesn't.
Sure. Yeah. But I think it goes deeper than. You wrote.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah. And I think some of them, like that proof that you have there on the board, that's like a recipe that says for an omelet, just cook it. Which for a certain audience is going to be right, because
You get that in if you put what's like the British bake.
oh, okay, there's a YouTube channel called what's it, Tasting History, that it's like historic recipes, but you look at these 19th century recipes or 17th century recipes, it says like cooking until it's done.
Yeah. Bake Off, because they're like trying to find out who's the best chef. And the recipe starts with like something like absurd, like 20 meringues, and, put them on a fondant base with this, and like all these people there are all like, oh yes, I know how to do meringues. I've done a million meringues. Yeah, there's a new audience. You're like, I have no idea how to do this thing. So it's a recipe in one sense, but
Right, but that's exactly what goes on with proofs. That in some contexts, proofs like just think, or this, like look at this. I don't know what's going on here, and just think doesn't help me on that one.
Doesn't tell at all.
And similarly, the proof is like just do another forcing construction or something.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's good enough, and sometimes some audiences need the detailed steps.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, it's exactly right.
Abbiamo visto delle aule per.
And I'm also wondering if you could like find some sort of book about cooking that has recipe-like things that are entirely indicative. Like, I'm thinking of some of the like more molecular gastronomy people who are doing things like they say, well, cooking eggs at this temperature, but at this temperature will do this structure, and I don't know if they make recipes or write descriptions of dishes that way, but that would be interesting to look up. But
That is a cool thought.
yeah.
I like that. Yeah, a lot.
And I guess the other thing I was thinking at a certain point, I mean, so I'm definitely going to be like I'm teaching the like intro to proofs thing in the fall, so I'll definitely be, I realized, yes, I really ought to be telling the students that, yeah, when you're writing a proof, you should do it in the imperative. And,
That's the other side, right?
yeah, but it also made me think like there are these many similarities and differences between philosophical and mathematical writing. And I don't know how often philosophy has the imperative, but it would be interesting to think about that because I think sometimes someone will say something, think about this.
Yeah.
That reveals whatever. And I don't know how often that happens, but it made me wonder, maybe there might be more effective ways to do.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe that would actually help.
That was great.
Yeah, thanks.
This is why I thought this stuff, right? It's not about diagrams, it's like, this is what I remember from, whatever, 10 years ago. I think that's like kind of your fault, right? Like, I feel like I've cheated you.
Yeah, that was a starting point. I mean, you developed this beautiful account. That was really great.
Yeah.
Many things. I mean, it's 3 parts that you were focusing on, but then you give this more general picture. Yeah.
But yeah, I've tried to find like written versions of what you were saying before.
There are no.
Yeah.
There's nothing about that particular flow, but where that was the history, let's say.
Yeah, sure.
That was the history.
But I was thinking about it. It's not like a.
Again, thanks because it was great.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for.
See you later.